then introductions will begin.
Okay, I think that means I am to welcome you now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome very much to Silicon Valley AAUW's annual commemoration of the Roe decision. I'm Vicki Reeder. This meeting is being recorded and a link will be sent to you at its conclusion when it's available. On January 22nd, 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Roe v. Wade decision declared a national constitutional right to abortion. The current court would then overrule Roe v. Wade in 2022 in the decision known as Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. President Trump took the oath of office this week before a Supreme Court he packed with appointees he could count on to reverse Roe, and that's what they did in Dobbs 2 years ago. That decision unleashed a surge of dangerous and deadly abortion bans, with 22 states now eliminating or restricting access in the wake of Dobbs. For over 20 years, Silicon Valley AAUW members have observed the Roe anniversary as a celebration of reproductive freedom. And then now we use this occasion to remember what has not just been lost, but deliberately and maliciously taken away, and to redouble our dedication to winning back our rights. I am so thrilled to be able to present to you Emily Bazelon, an American journalist, a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, a senior research fellow at Yale Law School, and co-host of the Slate podcast, Political Gabfest. Be sure to watch or listen on Thursdays. She is a former senior editor of Slate. Her work as a writer focuses on the law, women, and family issues. She has written 2 national bestsellers and is working on a 3rd book on reproductive choice. She graduated from Yale College and has a JD from Yale Law School. Before joining Slate, Emily was senior editor of Legal Affairs. She has written also for The Atlantic, Mother Jones, The Washington Post, The Boston Globe, The New Republic, and other publications. A couple fun facts about Emily that Wikipedia told me. Between 2012 and 2014, Emily made 8 appearances on the Colbert Report on Comedy Central to discuss the Supreme Court and anti-bullying issues. And she has since then appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, along with her Political Gabfest co-hosts. She's the granddaughter of David L. Bazelon, formerly a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, and she's the second cousin twice removed, maybe she can explain, of feminist Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan was the first feminist I ever came across as a young college student way back when. It is my great pleasure to welcome Emily Bazelon to this Zoom meeting.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was a lovely introduction. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I just want to make clear, I'm a journalist. I have covered reproductive rights and health for lots of years. I'm going to try to frame my remarks in a sort of informative way. Because I work at the New York Times, I don't take partisan positions, and I don't consider myself an advocate. So I just want to make all that clear before I start. I'm going to sort of set the table for us. I'm going to try to by giving my sense of the kind of lay of the land right now for abortion and contraceptive rights in the US since Dobbs. And then I'd love to take questions from you all. It's always more fun for me to respond to things that are on your mind and hear what you all are thinking. So I think the questions are going into the Q&A, and feel free to put them in as I'm talking. I'll take a break at some point and look at what's there. But it's great when there's some good questions to start with. As I'm sure all of you know, in some ways, Dobbs was quite a shocking opinion from the Supreme Court, and in other ways, it was not really a surprise, given how conservative the Supreme Court had become, particularly in the wake of the 3 appointments that President Trump had during his first term of office. And so, you know, if I had been asked to predict the morning that Dobbs came down, what was going to happen across the country, I think I would have said that abortion rights were going to diminish and contract, and also that the number of abortions was going to shrink. And I would have been correct about the first part of that sentence, but not the second part. So what we have seen on the legal front in terms of restrictions and bans since Dobbs are that abortion is almost entirely banned in 12 states. It's very much restricted in 4 others that have 6-week limits on abortion rights. And then there are a couple more states that have 12-week limits. So that obviously is a huge shift from the era of Roe versus Wade, in which the right to abortion was protected in the Constitution and it was truly a national right. I just want to sort of add a footnote to that, that even in the several years, maybe decade or more before Dobbs, there was diminishing access in the United States. There were lots of clinics that were closing. There were laws making it really difficult for clinics to operate. And there were a few states where there was really only one abortion clinic and it wasn't open every day. And people were really having to travel quite far to get to the clinic. So we did kind of live in that world before Dobbs, but then obviously the state law changes that I was just describing added to all of that dynamic. What has been, I think I will say, at least for me, the biggest surprise since Dobbs is that the number of abortions across country has not actually gone down. How can that be? How can you have, big swaths of the country, hundreds of miles in which abortion is essentially legal, but not necessarily a situation in which the number of people who succeed in having the abortions they're seeking goes down? And I think the answer to that is twofold. One part has been travel to clinics. Some clinics that, shut down in states like Texas, for example, then reopened, or a clinic much like them reopened across the border in New Mexico. So we've seen that landscape in several states. It's been true in Illinois, for example, across the border from Indiana. I hope that that geography was correct. New clinics have opened in Colorado, New Mexico, like I mentioned. For a while, lots of people were going to Florida until that 6-week ban went into effect. So some of this access has to do with travel, but even more of it has to do with the abortion pills. I'm sure lots of you know this, but there are 2 abortion pills, mifepristone and misoprostol. And before Dobbs, they accounted for, I think, fewer than 50% of abortions in the United States, but it was a much higher share of the whole in a lot of European countries. And since Dobbs, one of the shifts in the United States has been that now I think something like 63% of abortions in the United States take place with pills. Sometimes people receive the pills at clinics they have traveled to, but often they receive them in the mail. And this has been a huge shift in the provision of care. It started years ago with a doctor in Europe named Rebecca Gompertz, who was mailing abortion pills all over the world to countries in which abortion was illegal. And during COVID, Rebecca Gompertz started working with some doctors in the United States to try to increase access at a time when, because of the pandemic, people were having trouble getting to clinics. And the network that they set up then, the FDA then essentially approved the mail order provision of the pills in a way that really augmented the efforts of this particular network called Aid Access. And then also some companies stepped in to provide abortion pills within states in which abortion is legal. So we've really seen a kind of shift toward taking pills at home that people have ordered over the mail. There has been a lot of research showing that in almost all cases, this is a safe and effective way to have an abortion. Sometimes it's called self-managed abortion because you're doing it at home. Some people prefer it, some people don't like it at all. It means having a miscarriage at home, essentially, and there can be significant discomfort associated with that. In a world in which Dobbs is the law and states have banned abortion, for a lot of people, it has turned into the only realistic option. And so I think that it has this sort of importance, kind of no matter how people feel about the actual experience. In some ways, it has become a kind of lifeline, like it or not. So that's a really important part of the picture, and I'm happy to talk more about it. It is also something that is, I think, under more stress as a kind of systematic way of providing abortion since Trump's reelection. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But before I get to that, I wanted to talk about another, I think, really urgent consequence that Dobbs has had. And I'm sure you've heard some of these stories, but there have certainly been women in several states with bans who have not been able to receive care for a very wanted pregnancy. And these are often these really tragic stories of people who in their second or third trimester have an unexpected complication. Something goes terribly wrong. They need care. They go to the doctor, they go to the hospital in their state, and they're effectively turned away because the doctor who they go to is not sure that their life is actually at risk. In states like Texas and Idaho, et cetera, that is really the standard. A doctor has to say, if I don't give you this abortion, this D&C, you could die. And so women are being sent home with septic infections or being told that the potential loss of their fertility is not a good enough reason for this doctor to treat them in that particular moment, given the legal risk. The Biden administration challenged Idaho's enforcement of the ban because of these kinds of situations. And one of the facts that emerged in that case was that women were being regularly airlifted out of the state of Idaho to get the care they need for abortion and for what really in a lot of ways is miscarriage management. Because sometimes there are such urgent, present questions about the viability of a fetus that it's not even a healthy pregnancy that is under consideration. So, those stories have been, I think, for a lot of people, very disturbing. And there have been a few deaths that have been really in a kind of cause and effect way attributed to these laws, often by maternity review boards in the states at issue. This obviously came up in the last presidential campaign, and it has come up in also state campaigns over ballot initiatives. So I want to sort of recognize the suffering that has gone on in these cases, and at the same time make a sort of more kind of analytical, perhaps cold-hearted political point, which is that these cases, I think, have really distressed a lot of Americans and have been part of a shift in public opinion toward abortion rights, which did not exist before Dobbs. And again, forgive me if this sounds cold-hearted, but I do think there's a way in which these stories have a deep effect. And that brings me to what I wanted to tell you about in terms of state ballot initiatives. So another, I think, surprise since Dobbs has been that in state after state, when voters are asked, do you want to defend abortion rights, protect abortion rights, or do you want even more restrictions, voters have chosen the kind of pro-choice side of the ballot measure. And this started in Kansas about 6 weeks after Dobbs. Before the Supreme Court ruling, opponents of abortion had put a ballot measure to really restrict abortion in Kansas, and the voters rejected that ballot measure. And since then, that has happened in a number of states, including quite conservative states like Ohio and Missouri, Arizona, Michigan, maybe a little more purple, but not liberal bastions. There have also been a number of blue states that have in their constitutions enshrined the right to abortion with ballot initiatives. And I think all of that activity is part of this new political dynamic in which when you ask people whether they think abortion should be legal most or all of the time, they are more likely to say yes than they were before Dobbs. There seems to be something happening where now that abortion rights are truly on the line, people are reassessing their opposition to abortion or their kind of ambivalence about it. And I think that's been a really interesting dynamic. It did not obviously translate into a victory for Kamala Harris in November, even though she ran very strongly on abortion rights, on protecting abortion rights. And President Trump ran strongly on his record of ending Roe. He talked about that as an accomplishment that he was proud of. He praised the Supreme Court for it. And so, in some sense, there was a kind of puzzle, perhaps. Why were the majority of voters in Florida, Arizona, Missouri, both opting for protecting abortion rights and also electing a president who was very much on the other side of that issue? And I think we don't really know the answer, but here are kind of a few ways of thinking about this question. One is that President Trump figured out during the campaign that his stance going forward was going to be that he supported, or he says he supports, leaving abortion to the states. That is really different than positions he's taken in the past. But once he kind of settled on that as his answer to this question, he stuck to it. And maybe voters believed him and are kind of okay with that answer, especially because the ballot initiatives were giving them a chance to kind of express their views about the states and what they wanted in their own states. So that's one possible way of thinking about this. Another way of thinking about it is that no matter how popular or more popular abortion rights seem to be than they were before Dobbs, they weren't necessarily the top of mind issue for most voters. So in other words, lots of women of childbearing age will tell you that it's their top issue, but the electorate as a whole, their top issues were the economy and inflation and immigration. And so maybe when they had to bundle all of their views and choose a candidate, despite Trump's opposition to abortion, and particularly given his claim about leaving it to the states, they voted for him anyway. And all of this is obviously means that some of the answer to what is going to happen next in the country is really up to Donald Trump and the Trump administration. And I would say that I don't really know what they're going to do. And it's not because I haven't been following things they have said, but because of Trump's leave it to the states stance, I think he kind of stiff-armed the abortion opponents who really worked hard to elect him, especially the first time around, and also really got a lot of a lot of what they wanted from him in terms of his Supreme Court appointments during his first term. This time around, they have wanted things like a 15-week ban. And I think Trump is really distancing himself from that ban. I think the Republicans in Congress don't seem super jazzed about it either, at least a majority of them. There are other possibilities in terms of moves the Trump administration could make with executive power and the Department of Health and Human Services, the kind of regulatory executive arm of the government. And I don't think we really know what's going to happen, but I'll lay some of those out for you. So one thing that I expected and could still happen imminently, maybe it even happened today because I actually haven't looked at the news, but usually since for the last couple of decades, a Republican president has instituted what Democrats and pro-choice advocates often call the global gag rule for funding groups abroad in terms of whether they are able to discuss abortion to people they are serving. So far, I think, unless it happened today, the Trump administration has not issued that executive order. Like I said, it could be coming, but I thought that was sort of interesting given the big flurry of executive orders earlier in the week. There are a couple of other things on the table. Something you may all be thinking about is the Comstock Act. So this is a law from 1873 that is very much part of the Victorian era. And at the time, it was a statute that was supposed to address obscenity. Sending a nude picture through the mail was illegal for many years. There was like an actual guy named Anthony Comstock, and he actually was deputized by Congress to go around the country investigating people and triggering their arrests. And that was something that happened for like 50 years. people got in trouble for sending sexual materials and materials that facilitated birth control or abortion through the mail. The birth control and obscenity, the sort of sex parts of that law have been repealed, but the part about sending abortion materials through the mail is still on the books. The Biden administration said that nobody would be prosecuted under the Comstock Act. One big question I have is whether the Trump administration is going to withdraw that kind of internal guidance from the Justice Department and put the Comstock Act on the table. That would also, of course, be a question that involves the federal power over the mail, the US Postal Service. Right now, women, people all over the country are receiving abortion pills through the mail, including in states with bans. And no one has really been saying anything about it or doing anything about it. So one question is whether that is about to change. And that kind of brings me back to where I started, this kind of question of availability and access, because if the federal government tries to prosecute people for receiving pills in the mail or prosecute doctors or providers for sending them, then that could really change the reality on the ground since Dobbs and diminish the number of abortions, the availability of abortion, cause the kind of widespread cutting off of access that I think we have not seen so far. So I feel like I've been talking for a while. I'm going to start there. And I see some questions. So let's see. I will try to read a few of these out loud. Okay, how can a progressive Christian clergy person protect the rights of women with reproductive rights other than personal pastoral care? Here's one thing I think about a lot, and I am curious what other people feel free to offer feedback about this in any direction. So I sometimes think that the political debate over abortion and birth control makes it seem like it's very black and white. Like there is a good stance and a bad stance, a moral answer and an immoral answer. And honestly, like both sides can portray their side as the only correct way. And it can seem like a kind of blanket issue. And, look, like some people really do believe that every kind of ending a pregnancy, even an embryo, is an act of murder, right? And some people really do believe that abortion should be available like up until the point that a baby is being born, not afterward, but through the third trimester. Many people, however, have some kinds of beliefs that are somewhere in the middle of all of that, and they care about the circumstances that people find themselves in when they're seeking to end a pregnancy. There's just a big spectrum, and I often feel like we don't make enough room for people to recognize emotions like regret, even if they're not common, to just like think about this issue in a more gray area, morally complex way. And maybe that's something that clergy could be really helpful with, is kind of making a space for discussion that is accepting of a range of views and recognizing just the complexity of human viewpoints and human experiences with that issue. All right, I am going to keep going. If anyone wants to break in with their voice at any point, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll just keep reading questions. How do we protect the right to abortion pills by mail in our states? I live in Pennsylvania. Well, so you can certainly advocate for continuing to have a law that makes abortion legal in your own state. And Pennsylvania, abortion remains legal, certainly through, I'm not sure what the cutoff is for the number of weeks, but certainly through the second trimester and maybe later. Forgive me for not knowing the answer to that. In terms, and I should say that, in most states, whatever the law is for the legality of abortion is also true for the legality of medication abortion, having abortion pills and receiving them in the mail. The question really is whether the federal government is going to interfere with that right in a state like Pennsylvania or New York or Connecticut or California. And that is a question that's kind of at the level of national politics. So it will be interesting to see what your senators, especially Senator Fetterman, is thinking or saying about that. I know he's been making some overtures to President Trump of late. The other thing I think I will try to add to the discussion right now is this question of state shield laws. So one of the things that has happened since Dobbs are states asking themselves the kind of question you just asked and coming up with a couple of answers. The most, I think, interesting, potentially controversial, but really interesting answer has been shield laws that seek to protect an abortion provider in a state. So like an abortion provider in Pennsylvania who is trying to prescribe abortion pills to someone in a state like Texas, where it's illegal for them to have an abortion. And Pennsylvania does not have one of these shield laws in place. So that's something you could think about. It would really benefit people outside of Pennsylvania who want to have abortions. New York, Colorado, California, Vermont, Massachusetts have these kinds of laws in place. These laws are complicated. So what those laws say is that if I'm going to keep using Texas as an example of a red state with the ban, because they've been pretty aggressive in this area. So imagine you're an abortion provider in New York and you mail abortion pills to Texas. The law says that New York is not going to help Texas come after you in any way, won't help Texas prosecute you, won't help Texas with civil litigation, like won't process it, won't help Texas try to go after your medical license. The issue is that this is not actually a complete protection, probably. It is probably the case that because of the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, where one state has to fully credit the civil judgments of another state, that if Texas civilly sues an abortion provider in New York and there's a judgment entered against that provider, in the end, New York is going to have to help execute that judgment. In other words, like if someone gets sued, and this is actually happening right now, there's a doctor in New York who is being sued civilly in Texas for allegedly providing pills for a medication abortion. And if she loses her suit in Texas, in the end, New York is going to have to help Texas execute that judgment, which means like help Texas go after her assets. This hasn't actually happened yet. It's possible something will change the legal picture in a way that I'm not anticipating or just haven't thought of yet. But when you think about the composition of the Supreme Court and how conservative it is, the notion that New York would win and Texas would lose in this kind of dispute seems unlikely to me. And that could end up really changing the picture of abortion provision that has existed since Dobbs. Hang on one second. I just have to tell my dog walker that I am coming. I will be right back. I'm just letting out my dog.
This is just a momentary break while we notice that even people like Emily Bazelon have to take care of their pets. Stay tuned. Okay, here we go.
I reappeared. Sorry about that. I was talking about state shield laws. So anyway, we're going to find out some of the answers to these questions about the limits of state shield laws, one way or the other, in the next couple of years. And I should also say that in this world of ordering pills over the mail, the state shield laws apply to providers in the United States. They don't prevent people from mailing pills from another country. So these other more kind of underground networks in which people are ordering pills from countries like India that is going to be much harder, I think, for the federal government to stop. In order for the federal government to stop those pills from coming in, they would really have to start opening everybody's mail. And that is a level of surveillance that we just haven't really had in the United States. It's a little hard for me to imagine, but it's a question mark of the next few years. Yeah, let's see. Yes, women being refused care. Someone asked me to talk about women being refused care in states in which abortion is legal, but are being turned away because of religious tenets, Catholic-run hospital systems. Yeah, I mean, this has been an increasing part of conscientious objection, right? Is that not only, so conscientious objection is a right that obtains individually. Like a person can say, I don't want to participate in providing an abortion, or a pharmacist can say, I don't want to give out abortion pills at the drugstore. And some states have provided for those rights with conscientious objection laws. The Catholic-run hospitals are saying, like, we're just not going to do this in our hospitals. And you know what, the impact that this has depends a lot on what options are available in a place that you live. Hospitals don't do very many abortions. They do a very small percentage of the overall total, but they do abortions in the second and third trimester when people really are often quite desperate for care. And so if you live in a place where the network of hospitals is owned by a religious provider that doesn't believe in abortion, you can have a real problem getting the kind of care that you need. And doctors who provide abortion sometimes can be denied admitting privileges to those hospitals. So that's another way in which those kinds of kind of private, it's like a private means of enforcement, basically. And it can really change the picture of availability in a way that is significant for people. A number of members are worried about Trump taking on some Project 2025 provisions, like a gag order reinstated on talk about contraception, codifying Hyde, and Weldon amendments to restrict federal funds. What do you think? Yeah, so right. I mean, Project 2025, as Claire, as you're helping us remember, has a number of abortion restrictions in it. And, you know, remember, Project 2025 is this conservative policy blueprint for a future Republican administration in which they're really talking about how you use executive power to attain conservative goals. Like, how do you make the regulatory agencies work in this way? And we have had past Republican administrations that have tried to impose gag orders on American doctors who receive federal funding in terms of whether they can refer people for abortions. So that is a possibility. The Hyde Amendment prevents states from using Medicaid funds for abortions. It is just still law. Congress has like already codified that. I'd have to think about how that could become even more of a barrier. I'm sure there's something else they could do, and I just haven't thought of it yet. You know, in some states, what happens is that the state uses its own funds for public insurance to pay for abortion. And yeah, I haven't totally thought through whether that's something that could be at risk. Another thing that has come up is access to emergency contraception. Project 2025 calls for ending insurance coverages of Ella and Plan B, I think, which are both morning after pills. And this is part of a theory that abortion opponents have had, that some kinds of emergency contraception and even just plain old birth control are actually causing abortions. That they, rather than preventing or delaying ovulation, they actually like prevent the embryo from implanting, and that counts as an abortion. And so they should be penalized in some way. And that is something that, again, goes back to the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration approved Ella and Plan B as safe and effective. You know, a future HHS could, in theory, try to roll back those approvals the same way that I think the approval for the standard abortion drugs, mifepristone in particular, could also be, you know, under review under the Trump administration. We'll just have to see how much appetite they have for that. Yes, the mail does include private delivery services. That's a good question from Janet about the Comstock Act. The Comstock Act covers like FedEx and UPS and talks about like all delivery carriers or something in a kind of all-encompassing way. Would a published ERA 28th Amendment have stopped the Dobbs decision? I mean, that is just a great question. It's funny, when the ERA originated in the early 70s, maybe, well, actually, I guess there's a version of it that's like much, much older from around the time of the 19th Amendment. But anyway, when people started arguing about it for real in the late 60s and early 70s, the people who said it was going to affect abortion rights were like Phyllis Schlafly. It was the opponents of the ERA, and they were saying like, this is the kind of boogeyman reason to oppose the ERA. So I don't think we really know the answer. I mean, I think if the ERA were ever to become law, what it would actually mean would in a lot of ways be up to the Supreme Court. And so if you look at this Supreme Court, it's pretty hard to imagine them having any kind of like expansive reading of the ERA that would be generous toward abortion rights. And the text of the ERA itself does not, as far as I know, talk about abortion. So I think that's like really an open question. I appreciate the question in particular because it raises this, I think, deep question about whether abortion is necessary for women's freedom and equality. And that is an idea, an important idea that it was really missing from Roe versus Wade. Kind of snuck in to federal jurisprudence, federal court case law through Casey versus Planned Parenthood, which is the 1992 decision that reaffirmed Roe. If you read that carefully, you'll see that the majority opinion, which Sandra Day O'Connor took part in, does talk about gender equality for a minute or two there. And so that was a really important addition to Roe. But, this idea as being a kind of pillar of law that you could have the 14th Amendment, which provides for equal protection, and the 19th Amendment, which is about women's equal rights, as that those would be a kind of way of putting abortion rights on firmer constitutional ground. That's a kind of a place the country has, the Supreme Court has just not gotten to that place, not with 5 votes anyway. How much has the number of abortions increased since Dobbs? It would be a good fact to share. Let's see. I wonder if I could quickly find a link for you. So the answer is that it has increased slightly across the country. Yes, there are state-by-state totals. The New York Times has covered this. If anyone wants to look and post a link, you could look for a byline. It's the reporters who've written about this are Margot Sanger-Katz at the New York Times and Claire Kane Miller. So if you looked at that, I think you would be able to find a couple of stories they've written about the abortion numbers. There's a group called We Count that has been putting out national data, but that is broken down by state since Dobbs. Reverend Mary Blessing, let's see. She is saying that my answer was similar to what she actually does. Encouragement to continue the moral discussion by looking through a pastoral lens of care of the whole person and circumstances. I'm in California and have a sense of freedom to make sense for the conversations. I mean, I think that's really important. Oh, thank you, Amy, for finding that link. I'm often struck by the disconnect between the conversations I have with people, like regular people in the world about abortion, and the way that the politics plays out and the kind of statements of interest groups that I'm quoting as a journalist. They're just sometimes feels like there's a world of difference. Access to abortion, this is a question from Judy Kramer, used to be talked about more in the context of women's overall health. You mentioned a couple of instances where pregnant women's health has been jeopardized, which has caused some revisiting of a ban in all cases. Do you see this possibly creating movement nationally, or would that still be state by state? Yeah, I mean, this is such a good point about whether we talk about access to abortion as like its own siloed thing, or whether we think of and talk about it as part of just like regular women's healthcare. And I mean, this has been a kind of tension, or at least like a difference that's been present since before Roe. And to go back in history a little bit here, I mean, part of what is at issue here is how the medical profession thinks about abortion. So, the medical profession in the 19th century was actually like responsible for the first campaign to make abortion criminal. That happened in the 1860s and 70s. It was called the Physicians' Crusade. It was one of the first things the American Medical Association did after they were formed in 1848. And honestly, it was the first OBGYNs. They were men. They didn't like the self-trained female physicians and midwives who were then, you know, doing most labor and delivery care, and they kind of used making abortion a crime. They blamed the midwives and the female doctors, and then they used making abortion a crime as one of their tools for like taking over the field. So I think this question of, and then I should say that, you know, when abortion was illegal, really up to Roe, it was stigmatized and it was seen as this back alley procedure, and the doctors who would engage with it were seen as like bad. And in some ways, like some of the, I mean, obviously people died and got really sick from back alley abortion, so that was like real. But there also was this idea when Roe passed that the OBGYNs were really going to take over abortion and bring it into the mainstream field, bring it into doctors' offices and hospitals. And that really didn't happen. Instead, what we got were a network of clinics in a very like strong feminist tradition, but they were really separate in a lot of ways from mainstream medicine. And I think starting in the 1980s, when you start to see violence against clinics, and then later with legal restrictions, there's a vulnerability to being separate. And it also affects people's conception of abortion and birth control when it's separate. So one of the things I find really interesting in this area is the reproductive justice movement, which has a kind of forerunner in the 1960s, but really comes from Black women leaders in the 1990s. That's when they start calling it reproductive justice. And the idea is that people should have a right to have a baby and have that baby have enough resources to be able to raise children in decent circumstances, and they should also have the right to not have a baby. That these are like personal decisions, and that the healthcare system and really like justice and social welfare should put all of these possibilities and tools in the hands of individual people and families who are making these decisions. So I think that's one interesting way to frame this. What does it mean that Biden said that the ERA was law? Does it mean anything? I think the answer is that it means nothing, to be honest. I'm sorry to be Debbie Downer about this, but you know, presidents can say stuff and it can like not mean anything, especially if you say it at the very end as you're going out the door. You know, I mean, the other side of this is like Trump says that there's no more birthright citizenship, and the birthright citizenship is in the Constitution. So, you know, we don't want presidents to necessarily have the authority to just decide what the Constitution says without going through the entire ratification process and having the courts weigh in. I don't want to get into the details of like which states ratified the ERA when and whether the extension periods are valid or not, because it's complicated, but I don't think Biden weighing in is meaningful. There doesn't seem to be any restrictions on men's birth control methods or procedures. Maybe the ERA would have worked because of that fact. Well, I don't know about the ERA, but yes, it is really interesting that male birth control seems to be subject to a different set of standards. One thing I really would love to write about at some point soon are new methods of birth control that people are exploring. And one thing, I don't know a ton about this, but I will just share like one fact that struck me, which is that there have been some studies of like a hormonal pill for men, and the studies were actually halted because of the side effects, like men were getting depressed or having other problems. And what's kind of ironic is that the birth control pill has had some of those side effects for many years, and nobody said that women shouldn't take it because of those kinds of side effects. So, you know, part of this is like medicine evolves over time, but it is really interesting to think about those differences. Do I think a fetal personhood case can make it to the Supreme Court? Yeah, that is a great question. It certainly could. There are different forms of this, right? There's like a lot of states have laws that in some ways already recognize fetal personhood. Like a state will have a law saying that if there's a car accident and a pregnant woman is hurt, that you get to seek damages for the fetus as well as for the woman's injuries. There are also laws that you can sue for oh my God, I'm forgetting like what exactly the cause of action is, but basically, like there was a suit in Texas last year where a man said that because his wife had taken medication abortion after texting with her friends, that he could sue her friends for the loss of the fetus. And that's like just a regular old like negligence lawsuit. It's a tort claim. And Texas does recognize those kinds of lawsuits, like the loss of companionship from a fetus. And so it is possible that one of those lawsuits could reach the Supreme Court. It's kind of surprising in some ways that that hasn't happened yet. There's another much more like encompassing way of thinking about fetal personhood, which is that a fetus at any stage of development has all the rights of a human being and really would put the fetus on exactly the same legal footing as a person. Then you start talking about the idea that any kind of termination of a pregnancy or even like the destruction of an embryo is an act of murder. And that's like a very dramatic place to land. I have no idea what the Supreme Court would say about that. Yeah, Biden did try to sign the ERA into law into his last days. It's just that I don't think it really has any real effect. This is like a little in the weeds, but the National Archivist was like, sorry, you can't just say that the ERA is good law and we're not accepting the ERA into the Constitution unless it is validated by a court. That's the thing going on with that. Reproductive rights organizations that have good information on status besides we count. I think maybe you guys should advise each other about that. I'm not sure I'm the best source of information, and I also, as a journalist, don't feel comfortable like I'm not really sure how to answer that question in a way that feels journalistic, so I apologize for that.
Emily, I can just show
in.
you, Emily, this is Vicky. We will be sending out links to everyone who's here today with as much information as we can possibly collect.
Great. That
And
is
we have about
excellent.
10 more minutes. So I just wanted to give everyone a little warning. We're closing in on our time.
Okay. I feel like there's some things in the chat, but I'm going to stick to the Q&A for now. This is from Rion. The conservative argument for no federal protection of abortion is that it should be a matter of states' rights. However, their response to states who use their right of autonomy to protect abortion is to persecute them. That one state who has banned it would inherently outweigh another does not is a dispute, is not a fair application of states' rights, yet Republicans see no issue with it. Are there any laws for states' rights that could be used to actually protect states that allow abortion and their citizens from prosecution? So yeah, I mean, this is where this question of state shield law comes in, and I think I will look for my own piece about this and send it to you guys, because that I feel like I should be able to type in quickly. And this just, these state shield laws are trying to protect people. Oops. All right, I'm going to put this in the, let's see what is going to happen to this. I'm going to put this in the chat. So yeah, the way this works is basically that the state that is trying to protect abortion is saying to people who provide abortion, who help other people get abortions in other states, we are not going to prosecute you and we are not going to help Texas prosecute you. And we're talking about criminal prosecution, at least in current law. I don't want to like predict this Supreme Court, but in current law, those states have some good, solid footing for this position, because in really like the olden days, the way that these cases came about would be like someone would rob a bank in Texas and then flee Texas. And Texas would say to Missouri, like, wait a minute, the bank robber we want is in Missouri, and we need to be able to get them back. And the Supreme Court actually like didn't let the it said that there wasn't that states certainly could cooperate, but there wasn't a constitutional provision that demanded that a state turn over a person in that circumstance. I don't know what the Supreme Court would say about that in a world of medication abortion. Like, it's a pretty different kind of precedent than what we're facing now, but it is interesting to think about. I mean, there's another thing I always feel obligated to bring up in this circumstance, which is like, we do depend usually on states cooperating with each other on laws, right? Like, this is a really quite a pass that we've come to, in which the answer is for one state to tell the other state to get lost when it's trying to inform its own laws. It's sort of reminiscent of like when states were trying to chase down escaped enslaved people in other states, and those states were refusing to turn them over. And I don't think it's like a good thing that we've arrived at a moment in which that is relevant again. There's a lot of cooperation among states for law enforcement that is important in the country. Someone sent a male birth control study. That is excellent. The anti-abortion laws have interfered with routine medical care for pregnant women. I worked hard to be a physician. Why do we allow politicians to practice medicine without a license? That is a very good rhetorical question. And it is true that routine medical care in some places has become interfered with. You know, the line between helping someone manage a miscarriage and giving them what someone might term an abortion can be a really blurry one. And I think that is a real concern for a lot of people, that if we start scaring doctors about miscarriage management, or they start worrying that there could be some confusion of those categories, that's something that could really affect women's health care overall. All right.
I have questions that were sent in advance, Emily. And one that many people asked was, what can I do? How do I help? You know, people like me who live in California feel kind of secure that our state is going to be a bastion or a sanctuary against these intrusive possible laws. But do you have any advice for how people can be effective in supporting women in other states?
Well, I mean, there's like a range of answers for that. So I'll just like give you some examples. I mean, there are people who feel like it's their job right now to like smuggle lots of abortion pills into the country. There are people who feel like advocating for these shield laws and really helping them pass is something that is helpful for helping states out. I mean, helping women who are outside of their states. Um, you know, I think here's one thing I think I would argue is important, and it's a little self-serving, so forgive me, but some of these questions about like the Comstock Act and the mail and what's the FDA going to do, they're like important, but man, they're dense and boring. I mean, they're hard to get people interested in. And so if you have an appetite for learning about those things and explaining them, or like reading a lot about them, just like following that, I actually feel like that's kind of a service. One thing that was really striking to me was that, you know, last year and the year before, there was a lot of litigation going on over the abortion pill mifepristone. And one kind of side effect of those lawsuits was that for the first time, like, mifepristone was in the headlines. And when I was writing about abortion pills, I didn't have to like do a paragraph explaining how they work every time I wrote the story. I think in some ways the abortion pills and medication abortion remain kind of underappreciated and that's not a word, but like not well enough understood in the United States. And so being up on those things and explaining them to other people, other women, I think like just providing information is something that look, like I'm a journalist, so I think providing information is important. So you can take that with a grain of salt.
That's great. Can you just give us a real quick preview of what the book is that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So my book is like a sweeping history of all the things we've been talking about. It starts in the middle of the 19th century with this effort to make abortion criminal for the first time in the United States. And I've tried to have each chapter be about a different era. And one thing I really feel strongly, and I'm trying to emphasize, is that in every era, the only way that reproductive rights advance is through some really like kick-ass, fierce, rebellious women. And they usually have to have like a big fight and break some laws and like break some glass. And it is always demanded that. So I'm not like a radical person really in particular at all. And it's not my job as a journalist to be a radical, I don't think, but it's given me a kind of sense of what it takes to make social change, which I think is different than I had before. So anyway, that's the book, and it will start in the middle of the 19th century, and it will have a kind of pre-Roe third, and then it will have a Roe to Dobbs part, and then it will have a big chunk of the book that will be about the present and the things we've been talking about.
That sounds excellent. It's going to be published next year or the year after?
Give me a little more
One of
time.
those
I'll
years?
let you know.
Okay.
And I can come back.
It is 2 o'clock. In California. I see we have a question. I hope maybe we can, I think we're going to stop now. And thank you, Emily, so very much for your incredible knowledge and expertise and taking the time to meet with us today. We hope all of you that are on this webinar will take a picture of yourself. Just turn around, do a selfie with Emily over your shoulder, and then we'll compile all the pictures and add that to the information we send to you. So it has been an incredible honor to have you here with us today. Thank you again for all you are doing and will be doing in the future. Thanks to all for joining us today at the Silicon Valley AAUW commemoration of Roe. Thank you. And we have some comments here for you to read. And there's Emily's books. This information, the recording is still going on, so you'll get this when you get the link. And I hope the dog had a good time outside, Emily. And thanks again.
Thank you all very much for listening. I really appreciate it. Have a great
It
rest of
was
the day.
excellent. Thank you.
Bye.